The winds of England in the mid-15th century carried more than the sound of clashing swords and rattling armor. They carried whispers of dynasties rising and falling, of young lives broken under the crushing weight of power. And within those whispers lives the story of a young girl, Lady Margaret Beaufort, whose body and soul became a battlefield long before her name would ever be etched into history. Hers is not merely the tale of nobility, but of a child trapped inside the ruthless machinery of politics, forced to carry both the burden of her family's ambition and the future of a kingdom. Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443, a time when England was consumed by bitter divisions, the Wars of the Roses, where rival factions of the royal family, Lancaster and York, fought for the crown. But Margaret's fate was determined long before she could speak her first word. Her bloodline Lancastrian, though tenuous, was her blessing and her curse. She was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, but through an illegitimate branch. That stain of illegitimacy meant her claim to the throne was fragile, yet still dangerous enough to make her valuable. From the moment of her birth, Margaret was not seen as a child but as a vessel, a pawn, a prize to be bartered. In an age when women's worth was measured not by their voices or dreams, but by the alliances their wombs could secure, Margaret's destiny was written in the hands of men who would never ask her what she wanted. And so, before she could ever play with dolls or run through gardens, she was promised in marriage. Promised not once, but multiple times, her hands shifting between men as quickly as fortunes turned on the battlefield. By the time she was 12 years old, Margaret was betrothed to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI. Edmund was not a boy her age. He was a man in his mid-20s, hardened by politics, war, and ambition. To Margaret, he must have seemed less like a husband and more like an executioner of her childhood. At 12, she should have been safe in the embrace of innocence. Yet she was delivered into the hands of a man who saw her not as a fragile child, but as a means to secure his dynasty's future. Marriage for girls so young was not uncommon among the nobility, but consummation at such an age was a different cruelty altogether. And yet, that cruelty was Margaret's reality. At 13 years old, Margaret Beaufort became pregnant with Edmund Tudor's child. 13 and age, when her voice was still high with youth, when her body had not even fully grown, when her understanding of love or marriage was nothing more than shadows cast by the men who owned her fate. To carry a child at such an age was not just terrifying, it was life-threatening. But no one asked Margaret if she was ready. Her body was forced to bear the weight of England's future. The loneliness she must have felt cannot be overstated. History often paints noble women as symbols, as stepping stones in the march of kings. But behind the titles are girls who cried in the night, girls who prayed for safety, girls who wondered why the adults around them had turned their lives into currency. Margaret was one of them. Her nights in the dim chambers of Pembroke Castle were likely filled with fear, not only of childbirth, but of the man who was supposed to be her protector. Edmund, eager to secure his legacy, forced himself upon her, not waiting for her body to grow into the womanhood he demanded of her. But fate, cruel as it was, added another twist. While Margaret was still carrying his child, Edmund Tudor died of the plague, leaving his 13-year-old widow not only pregnant but alone. Imagine the terror. A girl barely past childhood, widowed, pregnant, her future uncertain, her body already stretched to its breaking point. In a world where men fought with swords, Margaret was fighting with her own life. And so came the day of labor, a day historians believe nearly cost her everything. Margaret went into childbirth at the tender age of 13. Her body far too small, her bones not wide enough, her strength not yet formed. Childbirth in the 15th century was dangerous even for grown women, but for Margaret, it was a brush with death. Yet through excruciating pain, through hours that must have felt like an eternity, she delivered a son. That child would grow into Henry Tudor, the boy who would one day become King Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. But while the world would remember Henry as the founder of a new line of kings, what the world too easily forgets is the cost at which he came into being. Margaret's body was so ravaged by the childbirth that she would never bear another child again. At 13 years old, her womb had given England its future king, and in return, it took from her the possibility of ever experiencing motherhood beyond that single, traumatic moment. It is here where Margaret's story takes on the weight of tragedy. She was a child forced to become a mother, her health permanently damaged, her innocence shattered, and yet she carried herself with a resilience that speaks volumes about the strength of women whose suffering is buried beneath the noise of history. Though she was denied the joys of a normal childhood, though her body was scarred and her choices stolen, she rose from that dark beginning to shape the destiny of England itself. But Margaret's tragedy is not only personal, it is universal. Her story is echoed in the lives of countless women across continents and centuries, who were denied their childhoods, who were used as vessels for power or profit, who bore children when they themselves were still children. Her pain, though rooted in the gilded halls of castles, is no different from the pain of young girls, forced into marriages in villages, plantations, or cities across the world. To hear Margaret's story is to confront the cruelty of a system that valued dynasties over dignity, bloodlines over bodies, and power over people. For Margaret Beaufort, survival was not passive, it was an act of defiance. Her son, Henry, would grow up under her watchful eye, and her political skill would eventually secure his claim to the throne after decades of bloodshed. But that triumph was built on the foundation of her suffering. To celebrate the Tudor dynasty is to also mourn the little girl who was broken to bring it into being. When we speak of kings and crowns, we often forget the mothers who bore them, their bodies torn, their youth stolen, their voices silenced. Margaret Beaufort reminds us of that silence. She reminds us that behind the story of every throne lies a woman whose sacrifice was never truly her choice. Hers is not a fairy tale of royalty. It is a brutal reminder of what it means to be trapped inside history, and of the extraordinary strength it takes to survive when the world conspires against your very existence. And so the child who became a mother at 13, who gave England its future king at the cost of her own body, would go on to shape history in ways no one could have imagined. Yet the tragedy of her beginning should never be forgotten, for it reveals the human cost of ambition, and the devastating truth of what it means to be remembered not as a girl, but as a vessel for a dynasty. The child Margaret bore at 13, Henry Tudor, did not immediately step into the world of crowns and glory. His birth was fragile, uncertain, and shadowed by danger. England was a kingdom torn apart by civil war, with the Lancastrian cause collapsing under the might of the Yorkists. The boy's claim to the throne was a blessing to some, but a curse to many others. It made him valuable. but it also marked him for death. For Margaret, who had nearly lost her own life to bring him into the world, that meant every breath her son took became a prayer, every day of his survival a victory against impossible odds. Yet Henry was not raised in her arms. Because of the dangers surrounding his bloodline, the baby was placed under the protection of others. Margaret, still barely more than a child herself, was denied the closeness of motherhood. She was left not with her son, but with the emptiness of her scarred body and the memories of her suffering. She became, in many ways, a mother without a child, and in that void grew something else, an iron will. If she could not protect Henry with her arms, she would protect him with her mind, her faith, and her relentless determination. Margaret remarried after Edmund Tudor's death, as was customary for a young widow of high birth. Her second husband was Sir Henry Stafford, a man more gentle than Edmund, yet her life remained bound by the shifting tides of war. The Wars of the Roses raged on, and Margaret, though often sidelined because of her gender, learned to navigate the dangerous waters of politics. She smiled when she needed to, prayed when she was powerless, and waited for the moment when she could act. Behind that composed exterior lay a fire, the conviction that her son's blood made him destined for greatness. In time, that conviction grew into strategy. Margaret may have been denied a childhood, but she refused to be denied influence. Through her marriages and alliances, she secured her survival. But always her thoughts returned to Henry. He had been sent into exile in Brittany for his own safety, and years would pass before mother and son would even see each other again. For Margaret, the separation must have been unbearable. To feel the life grow inside you, to nearly die to bring that life forth, and then to be forced to live apart from it, such is a grief history rarely pauses to acknowledge. But Margaret was no ordinary woman, and her grief became her strength. While the kings of Lancaster and York clashed in bloody battles, she plotted quietly. She built networks of loyalty, whispered promises into the right ears, and wove a web of faith around Henry's name. Each move she made was an act of resistance against the world that had stripped her of choice. She had been used as a vessel, but now she would become an architect of destiny. When Edward IV, a Yorkist, reigned over England, Margaret bided her time. She endured humiliation, watched her Lancastrian kin slaughtered, and carried herself with patience. She even entered into her third marriage, with Thomas Stanley, a man whose influence was vast. To others, it may have seemed another sacrifice of her body to political convenience, but Margaret understood power in ways few women of her era dared to grasp. If she could not fight with a sword, she would fight with loyalty, calculation, and persistence. Through it all, her faith sustained her. Margaret Beaufort was deeply religious, and she poured her suffering into devotion. Prayer was her refuge, but it was also her discipline. Faith gave her the strength to endure loss, and it gave her the language to cloak her ambition in the moral righteousness expected of women. She was not, in her eyes, seeking power for herself. She was carrying out God's plan for her son. That conviction made her unbreakable. And so, when fortune finally shifted, Margaret was ready. In 1485, after decades of bloodshed, Henry Tudor marched into England to claim his crown. At Bosworth Field, the last great battle of the Wars of the Roses, he stood against King Richard III. The clash was brutal, but fate so long cruel to Margaret had last bent in her favor. Richard was killed, and Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, King of England. Imagine the weight of that moment for Margaret. The son she had nearly died to deliver at 13, the boy taken from her arms. The exile she had prayed for and plotted for, he was now the King of England. The Tudor dynasty, which would define an era, was born out of her suffering. But while the world celebrated Henry's triumph, Margaret must have felt something deeper, a vindication that her life's agony had not been in vain. Yet, even as the king's mother, Margaret's story did not suddenly become one of ease and joy. She continued to live with the scars of her past, the loneliness of her early widowhood, the pain of childbirth, the years of separation from her only child. She and Henry were close, bound by more than blood, but history suggests theirs was not the tender relationship of mother and son who had grown together. Instead, it was a bond forged in duty, in destiny, in the shared knowledge of survival against overwhelming odds. Margaret embraced her new role as My Lady, the King's mother, wielding authority with a steadiness that few women of her time could imagine. She became a patron of education and religion, founding colleges at Cambridge, shaping the intellectual life of England. In these acts, perhaps, we glimpse the girl who had once been silenced, finding in scholarship and prayer the voice she had been denied in youth. But beneath the power, beneath the piety, her life remained the story of a child sacrificed for a kingdom. Margaret Beaufort died in 1509. Shortly after the death of her son Henry VII, she lived to see her grandson, Henry VIII, crowned a new king, a new chapter of the dynasty she had birthed. In death, she was honored not as a victim but as a matriarch, a builder of dynasties. Yet if we strip away the layers of crowns and titles, what remains is still that 13-year-old girl, trembling in pain, forced to carry the weight of history in her small frame. Her story is tragic, not only because of what she endured, but because it is echoed in countless others. Around the world, across centuries, young girls have been denied their childhoods, their voices silenced, their bodies used for causes not their own. Margaret Beaufort, though wrapped in velvet and crowned by history, was no different from those countless unnamed girls. She represents both the cruelty of power and the resilience of those who survive it. When we remember her, we must resist the temptation to see only the grandeur of the Tudor throne. Instead, we must see the girl who became a mother at 13, whose suffering carved the path for kings, whose survival was not passive but fierce, whose faith and willpower shaped the fate of a nation. Margaret Beaufort was not just the mother of a dynasty, she was a reminder of the hidden cost behind every crown, of the lives broken and reshaped in the name of power. Her story is a call to look beyond history's polished portraits and into the shadows where the human truth resides. To honor her is to honor the countless women who, like her, bore pain in silence, yet carved out legacies through strength, resilience, and an unyielding determination to be more than what the world demanded of them. And so, the tragic story of Lady Margaret Beaufort is not only England's story, it is the story of humanity's darkest bargains and brightest survivals. Pregnant at 13, broken in body but unbroken in spirit, she became a force that shaped the destiny of a kingdom. And though kings may wear crowns, it is often the unseen suffering of women like Margaret that makes those crowns possible.